Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the 2020 RECONNECT web conference. We now come to the final session of our conference, and we could not close our event without holding a panel devoted to the COVID-19 crisis. EU member states have imposed a broad range of measures that have severely affected the rule of law, with the justification of extreme circumstances of the tackling of the pandemic. And yet, now that the Union is slowly re-emerging from the lockdown, it finds not only the societal, but also the political and legal landscape profoundly altered. So our discussion will in many ways build on the previous panels with a twofold aim, taking stock of the emergency responses across Europe and their lasting effects, and secondly, looking to what EU priorities when it comes to the EU's role in safeguarding the rule of law in times of COVID-19. So to discuss these matters, we have with us Dr. Joelle Grogan, Senior Lecturer in EU and UK Public Law at Middlesex University London and convener of the Verfassungsblog Symposium on COVID-19 States of Emergency, collecting current insights on the pandemic and its impact on democracy and the rule of law. Mr. Michael Meyer-Resende, Executive Director at Democracy Reporting International and Coordinator of the Reconstitution Project on Exchange and Analysis on Democracy and the Rule of Law in Europe. And finally, Professor Alberto Lemano, Jean Monnet Professor of EU Law and Risk Regulation at HEC Paris and founding director of the Good Lobby. After the opening statements by our speakers, we will have a brief Q&A with selected questions from the audience. So please send your questions to me via the webinar chat box, indicating who you would like to reply. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Dr. Joelle Grogan.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you again to the Leuven team for what's been a fantastic conference today. So well done, chapeau. So in the next 10 minutes or so, I'm going to be outlining good governance recommendations in the emergency response to a global crisis, drawing on examples from within the EU and from beyond it. Now, all of these recommendations are going to be derived from the findings of the States of Emergency Symposium, which Alex, you just mentioned, that I convened jointly, which was jointly hosted by the Verfassungsblog and Democracy Reporting International, sorry, Michael, which was under the Reconstitution Program and supported by Stiftung Mercator. So over the course of 50 days in April and May, the symposium published 82 contributions from over 100 scholars throughout the world, which analyzed states of emergency and the use of emergency powers in response to the COVID-19 crisis from the perspective of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We published 74 country reports, including all EU member states, analyzing legal measures which impact nearly 80% of world population. The country reports were accompanied by 8 commentaries on democracy, human rights, and the rule of law in times of COVID-19, including 2 absolutely phenomenal contributions from my fantastic co-panelists, Alberto on the limits of EU health emergency law, and Michael on the rule of law stress test, that is the member states' responses to COVID-19. All of the country reports and all of the commentaries, in addition to my long-form analysis, which tracked global trends, concerns, and also emerging best practices as regards emergencies, are all available right now online on the Verfassungsblog. I'm also going to highlight right now that a RECONNECT working paper, which builds on the findings of that symposium, is going to be coming towards the end of this month or the beginning of next, depending on whether or not I get a holiday from my boss. So, to set the context, worldwide, the restrictions placed on individual liberty, movement, assembly, worship, education, and commercial activity, as well as on elections, parliaments, and the courts, are the most restrictive that we have seen anywhere in contemporary history. What is being asked of our healthcare systems, of our legal systems, and of our social systems, not to mention the deep personal costs and personal burden being placed on ordinary citizens and residents, is unprecedented. For these measures can cause a great deal of harm, but in order to comply with essential measures to combat the virus, public trust is essential. In this context and in this background, what I can say is we do have clear recommendations on what is good governance in the case of emergency. So I'm going to outline these 6 recommendations for what to do during an emergency, and the 7th recommendation is what to do when the emergency is over, what to do next. So the first recommendation, deliver rapid, decisive, coordinated, and collective action. A simple reality of emergency is that the earlier the reaction takes place, the easier it is to control and to mitigate the consequences of that emergency. And ultimately, the sooner the lifting of the restrictions, the sooner the beginning of recovery. While there is justified concern with overreaction, and we certainly have seen some states taking advantage of an emergency situation, one of the most immediate lessons of this global health emergency is that it has exponentially negative consequences for us to underreact. We're seeing this not only here in the UK, but in Brazil, the US, and Russia, which are now counted among the highest, they're now counted among the states with the highest infection and mortality rates worldwide. There are case studies in what happens when federal systems, or the complicated constitutional system that is here in the UK, have delayed intentionally inconsistent and uncoordinated action. Where the executive is denying, delaying, or delegating responsibility to local and regional governance, this creates a vacuum in leadership that only leads to negative consequences, negative and longer lasting consequences. The second recommendation of good governance in the context of emergency is to guarantee legal certainty and the clear and consistent communication of relevant law and policy. Regulations must be clear, they must not be open to vague meaning or different interpretation by state actors. For example, as has happened here, different police forces taking different interpretations of the rules. Clear, accessible, consistent, correct, and constant guidance with officials leading by example is essential. This not only has the effect of tackling the spread of misinformation, but is also critical to ensure the trust and high degree of compliance with measures. Citizens and residents rely on information to understand what to do. Clarity helps citizens manage their expectations and fears and ensures higher level of compliance. Now, incoherent or inconsistent government messaging with frequently changing rules and regulations leads to critical uncertainty and lower degrees of compliance. Now, an example of this that we've seen within the EU is Czechia, which introduced 65 regulations and 65 new resolutions within the space of 2 months, constantly changing rules and almost expecting their citizens to have a law degree to understand what was expected of them and to keep a constant eye on TV to see how rules were being updated almost daily. Conversely, Ireland sets an excellent example, producing a very clear and comprehensive and nicely coloured guide and tracking along their progress and development towards lifting of restrictions. Third recommendation for good governance, ensure the equal application of measures and only distinguish treatment for objectively justifiable reasons. Policing social distancing measures is a common feature throughout the world. However, there has been increasing evidence of targeted policing of minority groups and especially vulnerable groups, for example, of the Roma people in Slovakia. Equally, elected or government officials should never ignore, bend, or reinterpret their own rules that they themselves have designed at the risk of critically undermining their own legitimacy and the rule's efficacy. Again, I do not need to look much further than London for a local example of what that means. A larger concern relates to the autocratization of systems, where countries have taken advantage of the pandemic to consolidate power in the executive. The targeted use of these measures against political enemies, including journalists and the opposition, for example, of the coronavirus misinformation laws that we've seen not only throughout the world, but critically being used in Poland and Hungary, again raises the same concern. The fourth recommendation for dealing with emergencies is to ensure transparency in decision making. Now, a common factor among the most successful states has been the high levels of transparency in how decisions are being made. Essentially, who is making the decisions, what evidence there is for the decisions being made, and what is the reasoning that underlie these decisions. This is related to the more complicated questions of democratic and technocratic governance and the degree to which experts are being involved in the decision-making process. Where transparency underlies government action, there is a strong correlation between public trust and the actions being taken. Now, based on current trends, we're seeing fantastic examples of how this works in action in Norway, in Iceland, in Denmark, in Ireland, and in New Zealand, as well as Australia. Evidence teaches us, evidence proves that transparent government action promotes high levels of trust that can lead to the most positive outcomes on average. The fifth recommendation is to ensure political oversight and judicial review mechanisms. Now, it's essential in any system, and especially in any legal system, that insofar as is possible, the ordinary constitutional functions of the courts and the legislature continue. This is essential not only for the ordinary administration of justice, but also to ensure the oversight and review of executive action in an emergency. Political or democratic oversight and accountability acts as an important check on the use of power, on the quality of the law that is being made, and also on the reform of measures taken in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Good practice here can be seen in Finland and Latvia, who, among others, have adopted provisions to allow for virtual assembly of the legislature, and also in Germany and Romania in the modification of procedures to allow institutions to function as normally as possible. Limiting or suspending the work of the legislature, and unfortunately I look here to Ireland, is not rationally justifiable even in the context of a pandemic when, as we know from this very experience of this very conference, we've all become very au fait with virtual conferences and virtual meetings. Judicial review is equally essential as an avenue for the ordinary citizen to challenge the legitimacy or even the constitutionality of measures. Right now, I'm looking to the very recent moves in the Czech Republic, actually, or Croatian Republic, rather. Yeah, I've confused myself. Which is essentially suspending voting rights in the context of upcoming elections. I will check to make sure because I've just embarrassed myself and many members of both countries with confusing those two. So I do apologize to any members. Many states have endeavored to ensure the continuity of the courts, for example, through the suspension of oral arguments and the replacement with written submissions. The most notable innovation, and I'm looking here to Lithuania, has been the innovations as regards e-justice and allowing more remote access to the courts to be more widely available. The exclusion of executive action entirely from the scope of review is a profound concern, especially where courts lack any degree of independence, and particularly where there's little scope otherwise for either political or popular objection through elections or protests. The sixth and final recommendation in the context of what to do during an emergency to guarantee good governance is to ensure ongoing external engagement to reform law and policy almost constantly. While emergency necessitates urgent action, there is always capacity for subsequent review and reform. On this point, Italy is exemplary, and I would highly recommend reading the wonderful Joelle, who is a member of the RECONNECT project, and her report on Italy. Now, Italy suffered one of the highest mortality rates in Europe, and it was one of the first to introduce the most restrictive measures. But they were introduced, these regulations for the combating of COVID-19 were introduced so divergently across local, regional, and national levels as to introduce essentially regulatory and legal chaos. However, this quickly changed, responding to criticism from academics, lawyers, ordinary citizens, and the media. Directed at earlier provisions, the Italian government reformed legal measures to be more clear and consistent and to have constitutional safeguards and protections for the rule of law. Finland here offers a best example of good practice for their review of constitutionality and rights compliance of executive degrees in the context of standing committees and engagement with external legal experts, and also putting everything online, even as it processes through the legislature. The best practice evidence globally is external engagement. It's essential to guarantee public scrutiny, particularly in current times when there is more limited capacity for political scrutiny. It essentially improves the quality of the law being made and the public policy being applied. The final recommendation is for when, and this will happen, but when the emergency ends, and that's to learn, to adapt, and to reform. States which experienced and reformed measures following the SARS pandemic responded more quickly to the COVID-19 crisis and have had, on average, the best and better outcomes. New Zealand has had one of the best outcomes because it looked around at what everyone else was doing and it created measures accordingly. COVID-19 and the measures taken in response to it are on a scale and a level that is unprecedented. It's not comparable. Legal, social, economic systems will be radically changed and have already been changed by what's going on. The way that we respond, the way that we learn from this crisis is going to be critical, not only in terms of preparation for a future crisis, if there is one, but also in how quickly we recover from the current one. COVID-19 ultimately has exposed endemic economic and social inequalities, exposing existing fissures in society, as the virus and the measures taken in response to it have disproportionately affected the most vulnerable members of society. How member states respond now and in the future, how the European Union responds now and in the future, will be determinative of whether or not those fissures are, well, brought back together, or whether or not this will be the geopolitical shattering that Alberto has mentioned. Essential to response, essential to recovery is solidarity among communities and trust in governance. But these are built and they're earned. They're not just a given. So thank you, Alex, and I pass on to my wonderful panelists.
Thank you, Joelle. Thank you so much for providing us with this very broad and comprehensive landscape, which includes also insights from outside the European Union, and indeed kind of clarifies how COVID-19 is very much a catalyst in entrenching certain trends, such as executive decision-making, or even the emergence of and further entrenchment of autocracies, and other fundamental principles such as legal certainty and issues such as trust with citizens, of course. I will now move on to our next speaker, Michael Meyer. You may have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Joelle, in particular, for your remarks. I second them. I agree with them. I think we had an extraordinary month behind us, also as a legal community. There was a lot of quick response from RECONNECT, from Verfassungsblock, obviously, from other organizations and networks, and I think that was very positive. I also admit at times I wondered a bit, you know, are we really helping, or are we making things more complicated for those who have to respond fast? But at the end of the day, I think the legal discussion is often a discussion about principles and good policy, and that discussion is always good to have, and even within an emergency. So I think it's good we had it. The moment, as Joelle said, was absolutely extraordinary and still is. It was a situation where we had human rights restrictions across Europe that we would have considered completely incomprehensible just 2 months before. And in connection with the restrictions, you also had a lot of pressures on institutions that are supposed to look at them, in particular courts. So as we all know, many courts de facto couldn't work very well, especially in the first months. So that put a double pressure. You know, you have widespread human rights restrictions, and at the same time, you have a court system that doesn't work at normal level of efficiencies that I think merits the name of a stress test. And if we look at the bigger European picture, it came in a very sensitive moment, because this summer, this year, we discussed the next multi-annual framework, the EU funding for the next 7 years. And now, because of the crisis, added to that a crisis response, very significant funding as well. And around that discussion, we have a very lively debate between member states and in our communities about conditionality of payments in cases where the rule of law is not properly respected. So we have a situation where rule of law is becoming much more important. And interestingly, today was published an opinion poll of in Germany of what do people expect from the German EU presidency, what are important subjects. Corona is the first, of course, but I think among the top 3 is rule of law suddenly, and that never happened before, because most people don't even know exactly what you mean when you say rule of law. Some more people now understand what Rechtsstaat means if you ask them here in an opinion poll, apparently. And then we also have the European Commission doing its monitoring exercise. So in September, we will get reports on 27 EU member states. And the EU has to measure something that is in great flux and is much harder to measure now, I would say, than a year ago, because a lot of things have happened and are happening at great speed. So we have all this happening in a rather complicated moment, let's say, for the EU. I think we should also be clear that we are still deeply inside. We have a lot of relaxations. We have states of emergencies that have been lifted, but of course we are still restricted in many things we can do in many European member states. And there's also this constant talk about the second wave. It may come and we go back to many of the questions, or the fact that it's discussed and kept in the air alone also, of course, is a question that should occupy us as a human rights community, what that means. What does this constant Damocles sword of a second wave actually mean for policymaking? I think when we look back at the first weeks, and we published, or I wrote that in Verfassungsblog also, there was huge amount of improvisation. Many things were not very convincing from a legal standpoint, but many member states corrected themselves, and Joelle mentioned Italy, and there were many others who did that. So I think in such moments, we should really look a bit at good faith also. You cannot in the first weeks expect that everything goes great, but you would expect that people, governments, legislators try to improve, and in many cases they have done. And I think we were critical of Hungary in particular, because the government, in our view, went from an okay constitutional solution to something worse after 2 weeks. And we were also critical of Poland, because it turned this into much of a political power game around the presidential elections, and I think that was very tangible and very problematic. And just to open a bracket here, we will have the second round of Polish parliamentary elections. The results are likely to be very close between the 2 candidates. We have a situation of high polarization, where many people don't trust that the other side is dealing honestly, and especially a lot of distrust that the government runs an election honestly. We have an appeals chamber in the Supreme Court, which hasn't been so much in the spotlight yet, but it would deal with any election appeals that often come out of tightly run elections. We have COVID measures that still don't allow demonstrations beyond 150 people. It's often broken and accepted by authorities, but it's still in the law, and demonstrations have been very important for the Polish opposition. So I think we should all look quite closely at what is happening in Poland in the next 10 days, because many of these problems come together here. That was just in parentheses on Poland. I would say if we look forward, we should absolutely see it as a chance to learn from this. More disasters may happen, there may be pandemics, but you can think of many other things. You know, nuclear power plants can explode, there can be military aggression somewhere. So I think you can think of many possibilities of public emergencies that affect us all, and this gave us a real chance to learn. How to learn, I think that needs discussion. I'm a big fan always of the Venice Commission, so I would be very happy if that forum is used to look back and really try to establish in soft law maybe what we would consider as a good framework in the future to deal with responses, but we could think of other ways also to do it only within the EU. And I think the issues are all on the table and they have been discussed already, but they need more reflection. I think one is calling a state of emergency, is that actually good or bad? And the EU was quite split. I think around half the member states did, the other half didn't. We could have a long discussion here. I think I quite like states of emergencies because they're transparent and they clearly signal that it's not normal and that it has a timeline and that it should end. But I know it's a long discussion, but that's something I think to discuss. What is the state of emergency? What's the difference between a legal one and a de facto one? And how does that all work, that there's some transparency? Another aspect I think the legal community has not discussed too much and I think needs more discussion is communication. And I'm glad that Joelle, you mentioned it. Especially when we talk about human rights restrictions, we all know about necessity and proportionality, but you can only measure that if you know what is the threat assessment by a government and what does it try to achieve. And the German government, for example, never ever published in written what it tried to achieve. And I think that's quite problematic to judge everything it's doing. Of course, here things are complicated with the federal system, but just various different things were mentioned depending on when you ask. So different parameters like reproduction rate or things like that came up, but it was never quite clear what, what's the yardstick here? Why are you doing these things? And when do you plan to change them, on what basis? I think that needs a lot more discussion because that's important for effective response, but also for democratic policy making, of course. Another issue maybe could be discussed more is corruption. I mean, if we spend a lot of fast money to respond to crisis, the corruption risk is much higher, of course. Speed speaks against transparency and checks and balances in spending public money, EU money or national funds. So a lot more, I think, needs to be discussed there, how we deal with this. Personally, I feel one should at some point make it conditional that member states sign up to the European Public Prosecutor if they want to benefit from that kind of fast money, but many other things may be thought about. Legal certainty, Joelle mentioned it also. We had really in many countries a lot of huge numbers of decrees and laws and maybe constitutional changes, and it was very hard to keep the overview and to look through that. So there's a lot to be said about that also for the future. And the point of expertise, technical expertise versus government decision, I think in a democracy also needs to be discussed much more. There are many attempts to hide behind scientific advice, and I think it's democratically very questionable. At the end of the day, a government has to own what it's doing. It can highlight and be transparent about whose advice it's taking and why, but it cannot pretend it stops making decisions and it's virologists now who took over government. I think that we could have clearer guidelines also. So in conclusion, I think there's a lot to discuss. The question is, how do we keep the momentum in all this? What kind of processes can we take in place? There will be corona fatigue soon. The next problem will occur. And we should not forget this lesson. I think we all know that many developments have become more volatile, and we can be stronger if we have a stronger European framework. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for highlighting what are the many lessons that we can draw from a crisis such as this one, going from the implications of a state of emergency to the importance of communication to citizens, corruption with regard to EU funding, of course, and the reach of technical expertise within democratic decision making. So thank you so much. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to our final speaker, Professor Alberto Alemanno. Your microphone is switched off. We should hear you now.
Now I'm unmuted. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me well? Thank you, Alex.
Yes.
Thank you to the RECONNECT project for the kind invitation, and to my fellow panelists for setting the scene and providing so many ideas and reflections on the current circumstances. I will do my best to complement some of those ideas with a few insights coming from a special issue of the European Journal of Risk Regulation, which has recently been published, and whose focus was to unpack the regulatory response of the EU and its member states by focusing in particular on the dominant approach which has been adopted initially by Italy, then by France, Spain, and so forth and so on. What I define as sort of regulatory emulation, which was probably driven more by exogenous pressure as opposed to the scientific realities, or at least the epidemiological realities, which were present at the moment. So I think it's important to highlight the acritical dimension in which we assisted to a rapid spread and diffusion of those approaches. And we have been trying to figuring out the dynamics that occur at the time. The other part of my COVID-related work has to do with the role that civil society played, or it should have played, and it will play in the future. And I think this could be more interesting for the audience because it will complement and add further elements to what has already been said. So this has been an extraordinary event, which might partly justify the exceptional nature of some of the measures adopted, but is also an event that was largely foreseeable, not in its own specifics details, but we all knew for a long time because of the alert system we have created, because of what the scientific community has been saying, that this pandemic would have occurred at some point in time. And obviously, it is the role of law and the public policy system to be ready and to create a framework capable of handling an extraordinary circumstances with the calm and rigor that characterize the application of the rule of law. Despite this, I would say both the EU and the member states at the EU level have been caught by surprise by this event. And civil society in particular has been caught by surprise by the response that the European Union and member states had in relation to these particular circumstances. We have assisted to the adoption of draconian measures, as I said, characterized by a very, I would say, unsophisticated approach, the very same approach that was adopted in 1918 from the previous large pandemic, which basically consists in social distancing and non-pharmacological approaches, which basically create a policy which is generalized and which is entirely undiscriminated. So you apply the same measure to everyone, regardless of whether you are tackling a vulnerable group, people who are older than 65 years old, or you are tackling a population who is 30 years old, in which appears much less likely to be infected or actually to carry major negative consequences, which might move from morbidity to mortality. This has led to an unprecedented compression of both individual freedoms and collective ability to organize, mobilize, engage by civil society, which is absolutely unprecedented. And we can still, I think, express surprise by the overall social acceptance that those draconian measures have registered across Europe, with very few episodes of rejection. This situation of compression could have been partly be avoided or be mitigated. So some of the papers we have published on the powers of the European Union in public health seem to challenge the conventional wisdom according to which the EU had no competence whatsoever to somehow coordinate or better coordinate the adoption of national measures. So I think it's important to become a bit more sophisticated in realizing that the EU, by exercising its full power, including those which are limited under Article 168, could have limited the negative impact on the rule of law. And many negative circumstances that have occurred in relation to which we're still victims could have been prevented if the European leadership would have been able to fully exploit the exercise of such competences. The classic example I provide is the attempt the European Commission should have had or should have tried in creating a consistent approach in relation to the collection of data, the measurement of epidemiological data, in order to allow comparability. Even today, with the virus spread going down, we are still unable to compare the different rates of morbidity and mortality linked to exposure to COVID-19. I found this very regrettable in particular because the dominant narratives keep suggesting that being the European Union not competent in public health matters, we cannot blame the Union. It's not a matter of blaming, it's a matter of realizing what could have happened if the EU had taken full competence and full political leadership for taking advantage of powers which have been only be enhanced in 2009. So Article 68 since 2009 refers for the first time in the treaty to cross-border health threats. So there has been an anticipation for creating the conditions for the EU to act. We all know that at some point the Union in particular the Commission tried to step in by providing a roadmap in order to govern the introduction and then the lifting of different measures, in particular border measure and border checks. But we also know that member states have been basically departing quite systematically from those guidelines. And they didn't even fear the pressure that the European Commission could have been exercise its own prerogative and bring and go after those countries and even threaten them for an infringement action. Not even the most, I would say, manifest breaches have been the object of criticism by European commissioners. And also this is something I find quite surprising, all the more so given the complacency that the national political class, in particular of those countries which more or less were doing their job properly, have proven. This situation is particularly, I think, problematic today when you look at the negative impact that COVID and the response to COVID had on civil society. Civil society has not only been silenced, but has also been chilled in exercising its own prerogative. Civil society has been at the forefront since moment one. NGOs have been providing protection to vulnerable population. They've been filling the gaps when it comes to healthcare support, but civil society has not been part of the picture. No measure adopted by national authorities or European authorities has been the product of a process of co-creation or at least consultation with civil society. So even the NGOs who were on the ground, who were experiencing both COVID and the effect or unintended consequences to the response to COVID, were not able to voice, were not able to engage with public authorities. They consider this a missed opportunity by public authorities not to be able to be in touch and to reconnect with those organizations who are capable to immediately work as a feedback loop, capable of allowing authorities that in a situation of emergency are under a legal obligation to reconsider, readjust both scientific evaluation, risk assessment outcome, but also risk management measures to actually do so. As such, I would say the European response to COVID is in unveiling, even today, some of the structural weaknesses, not only of the rule of law oversight mechanism that we know well and we knew well before, but they've been expanding our awareness about the existence of structural awareness that prevents civil society from doing its job or for accomplishing its own mission. So we have seen, for instance, that NGOs around Europe have been extremely fragmented in their reaction to the silencing and the chilling effect from public authorities. They were not able to coordinate. They were all preparing public letters, manifestos, but were not able to coalesce into a potential coalition that at the end of the day would have been much more effective in conveying the message, which was, we want to be listened, we want to be able to continue to do our work and our mission, but we need to be in contact with you, policymakers. And this fragmentation is a constant feature of European civil society, but is very much driven by some structural features of the funding mechanism, which are allowing civil society to exist, both from public funding, European funding themselves, but also private philanthropy. So today, the incentive mechanism for the average civil society are those looking for individual engagement, as opposed to collective engagement and coalition building. This is deeply problematic in a situation of emergency because we cannot afford to have individual organizations looking for the ear and the bandwidth of public authorities on their own. We need to create the conditions for them to be incentivized to be effective by working together. However, this hasn't really happened, and actually it occurred the opposite. Another structural feature that I would like to briefly highlight before wrapping it up is the fact that we have also seen a inherent, I would say, limited advocacy capacity by the average NGO. So non-profit organizations, most of them are very much into service delivery, suddenly felt the need to engage with policymakers, but they didn't know exactly how to do it. Their overall literacy in relation to the public policy process seems to be incredibly limited. So when you go upstream and you try to realize how is it possible that only a tiny minority of nonprofits in Europe engage with public authorities and do advocate in order to attain their mission, is also driven by structural factors, and among them the historical reticence of private philanthropies to basically engage with the political sphere, and therefore to allow NGOs to be enhanced in their ability to engage with public actors. So all this lead to a situation in which we should, I think, like my colleagues, ask ourselves what we have learned so far, what we're going to be learning from COVID. Because there's a moral duty, if not a legal duty, to learn something from what it occurred and from what it actually went wrong. And unfortunately, most of my research so far suggests that the learning component has been extremely modest. It is probably premature to come to conclusion, but when you look at what is happening now and what is on the table in Brussels, we see the MFF, as Michael was discussing, that most likely will have a victim. And the victim for negotiating and agreeing on MFF in July, meaning in the next couple of weeks before the holiday break, will be the rule of law. So the conditionality discussion today seems to come after the need to address the market pressure and the overall public silence that emerged around the rescue package, which unfortunately hasn't been reached or touched upon the rule of law. I think Germany, Michael, is an exception in the ability also of policymakers in the media sphere to highlight the circumstances occurring in Hungary, in Poland. They are very often covered. This is not the same in many other parts of Europe, notably in the South. Those countries who have been pushing for the rescue package and do not seem to be ready to make any trade-off between the need to have a rescue package now and the need to think long-term about the merits of attaching conditionality. And the second negative aspect of this, where I can say there's not much learning, is the fact that the new MFF proposal currently entails a reduction of 20-25% of the current funding in the Rights and Value program. This is dramatic because the Parliament and civil society have been asking for tripling the overall amount that civil society organizations should have received to basically do their job, which is also to hold the governments accountable and therefore acting as a bottom-up oversight mechanism of the rule of law. So when you combine these two elements, you clearly see that we are a bit in trouble. There's a lack of political will, but also a lack of political imagination and legal imagination to potentially shift to a new paradigm shift in which we move away from Article 7 discussions, which are top-down by definition, and they are questionable in terms of legitimacy and buy-in with civil society, to a more bottom-up, in which should be civil society to put pressure, not only at the national level, because the rule of law is still a national story in Europe, and to create transnational dynamics. Because unless we create transnational solidarity on the rule of law oversight, we're not going to be able to get out of this situation. Unless people in the south of Europe feel deeply about the protection of the rule of law in Hungary or in Poland, we're not going to be able to prompt dynamics capable of creating a sort of deblocking process on the current political impasse on the OMMF or the current, I would say, positioning of the different national interests. Sorry for being gloomy, but this is what I feel at the moment. I really hope to be proven wrong in the next few days.
Thank you so much, Alberto. And I would go directly to our Q&A. We already have a couple of questions from our audience, who I remind they can still, of course, send the questions to me via the webinar chat box. We have a question from Professor Geert van Kelster, who asks, would the devil's advocate suggest that the crisis has shown the EU, firstly, failing in its clear task of upholding core freedoms such as free movement, or at least better monitor their infringement, and two, see its lack of power reinforced at political levels where public health measures at the moment seem to be most effective, which is at the very local level, which incidentally is a confirmation of the subsidiarity principle. And then we have Andrea Schopkins, who builds upon, I think, what Alberto Lemano has brought in from a civil society perspective, which is there is another essential issue which comes up in parallel to COVID-19, which is the issue of civil society protests against racism. When one takes racism only as a very evident example, then one could say that the crisis launches a fundamental energy of protest against never overcome discriminations in their factual existence. So do you think that the EU, including member states, should together restart to concentrate on measures and politics of all sorts of non-discrimination between EU citizens and towards EU foreigners? And I suppose I can elaborate on these first two questions with a question that perhaps I can direct to Joelle in the first instance, but also to the other speakers, which is, in light of the COVID-19 as a catalyst for all these kinds of negative trends, what kinds of reforms should we see at an EU level to cope with future emergencies, but also in addressing more specific issues, such as the engagement with civil society, of course, which can be seen, as a watchdog, as a source of democratic representation, communication, of course, and so on. And then finally, of course, solidarity is the other key principle that COVID-19 brings into question, as we have seen. But of course, what will happen to solidarity as it has been challenged over the past few months, as you've mentioned? And can we have a European democracy without solidarity? I would give the floor back to Joelle and then to the other speakers.
Thank you, Alex. Some really fantastic questions there. So to have the honor of being the first speaker, so I can pick and choose which questions I want to answer, and leave all the wonderful tricky questions to my wonderful co-panelists. I think there was a big question as to the EU's response, or, well, the EU's lack of a coordinated response. The EU hasn't really appeared, at least to the ordinary citizen, as one of the big players in terms of the determination of what measures are applied. In almost all contexts, it's been a national response, and this isn't just within the EU, this is globally. It has been primarily, if not exclusively, a national response, or in the case of Belarus and a few other states, non-response. But this means that at a very critical time in the EU's development, it's appeared institutionally weak and critically weak in the eyes of the ordinary person. And there's a lot of arguments going on that this could be a time for the rebalancing of power, if ever that was just an idea, but a rebalancing of power between the EU and the member states. Now, what I would argue, and this is where I depart from the findings of the symposium and instead look more contextually as to what's going on and also how recovery has happened previously. And I would say that even if national response has been critical in that first response to the COVID crisis, in terms of recovery and international recovery, the EU is going to be critical. They're going to be critical in that stage of exiting an emergency, in the reopening of borders and in the coordination of reopening borders and the coordination of larger questions in terms of the movement of trade, of people, and of, well, essentially the essential steps of social and economic recovery. And this brings into the next point, which is that key value that we talk about, but much like the rule of law, is much maligned and much debated, which is solidarity. Now, one thing that I can say in terms of observations internationally is that states, and I mean this broadly in terms of countries, but also communities, local government, any conceptualization of community, those who have embraced the idea of solidarity, the idea that we are accepting more burdens, we are accepting more measures, we are having higher degrees of personal social responsibility and compliance with very difficult measures, have better outcomes on average. I take two extreme examples of the last 2 weeks, which is Nigeria and the US. In Nigeria, there's a critical problem right now that a lot of citizens, a lot of residents do not believe the coronavirus is a real threat. They think if it exists, it is something only of the elite and only of the rich, that only rich people get coronavirus because they're the only people being reported as having it, essentially because they have the access to healthcare. Similarly, in the US, there's critical issues as regards the provision of healthcare, because it is divided. There is private and more limited public healthcare. Now, this is critical in the question of solidarity when a global virus, a global health epidemic, an epidemic virus, needs everyone to be treated, needs everyone to be following measures. There cannot be that kind of division of I can afford healthcare and you can't. So in terms of reform, this is the key and critical question. I would stand by my 7 recommendations as being equally applicable to national states and their responses as the EU. And I would finally just echo so much of what Alberto has said and also Michael has said in terms of the MFF, that rule of law conditionality, that doesn't, I would ultimately be surprised if a robust version of rule of law conditionality survives into the future, even though it is critically necessary as we look to recovery with huge financial packages. I pass over to my excellent co-panelists.
Apologies. Michael, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question, the performance of the EU. And of course, it didn't perform that well, and nobody did. I think that's clear. No government performed amazingly. The German government's performance is wildly overstated how good it was, in my view. It's a bit of a myth. In some way, things work better here, but I think it's all shades of gray. It's not the black and white that many media now try to describe. And the EU also was part of that failure, I would say, in the beginning. Beyond that, I'm a little bit critical of making it a moment of saying, oh, this shows we need more integration and EU has to do much more, and next time it should be the EU. State of emergency type situation is extremely sensitive. EU's level of legitimacy is thinner than that of the member states. It's just a fact of life of Europe today. And I think to call on the EU to play a much more assertive role is a little bit bringing a weak soldier into the line of fire, so to speak, where actually the member states are better suited to come in. And even, it was also mentioned, the question of the local level. If I go on a park bench in Berlin and I'm penalized for reading a book, which happened here for a while, which was very unreasonable, then it would be very damaging if some people would say, well, that's what the EU decided, you know, and it was clear, I think, here to everybody, no, that's what your government in Munich decided, or the city of Berlin. And I think that's better for that kind of situation. But I would go with Alberto. Of course, it should be a sophisticated system where all levels play a much better role. And there the EU can do a lot more, and Alberto has looked much more closely into it, so I will not repeat what he said. But I like his point that especially on information provision and transparency, that would be an excellent role to say, look, this is an EU-wide crisis and we know what's going on and we can advise. And again, in Germany, the most authoritative source for all kind of numbers is the university in now I forgot the name, but you know which one I mean. Everybody is referring to. No, Johns Hopkins. Everybody talks about Johns Hopkins, and I wonder why we cannot do that ourselves in the EU. And then the question of racism, I would see it a lot as a class issue, and I come there also, I align with what Joelle says. I think I haven't looked in many details, but for example, I live a lot in Portugal, also in Lisbon, and now you have restrictions exactly in the neighborhoods of Lisbon that are clearly socially disadvantaged. So something went wrong there. We have universal healthcare, it's different from the US, but apparently something didn't work in public education in explaining what the problem is, and suddenly they have much, much higher infection rates than the other neighborhoods of Lisbon. And I think this pattern we see in many places. So there, I think policy has to look a lot at what that means, and it can, of course, spill over also into other kinds of discriminations, if you think of Roma, etc. But there's clearly a differentiation of effectiveness depending on social class, I would say, of the population.
Alberto, you have the floor.
Thank you, Alex, and thank you for the great questions. I will be building on what has been said by my fellow panelists by probably saying that the European Union missed an opportunity to look more relevant and credible vis-a-vis the average citizen, despite the inherent limit to his own action and the fact that the member state didn't allow the Union to fully exercise his own prerogative. The Union is now catching up. When you look at the rescue package, probably what occurred over the last few weeks would have never occurred without the pandemic. The classic line according to which crisis allow the acceleration of integration seems to be proven. And on the sanitary crisis, not only the financial crisis, we also witness calls for the creation of a health union. That's what we are currently working on a special issue, a follow-up special issue of the European Journal Risk Regulation, trying to figuring out what would it mean to have a health union. So I gave you an example about common methodologies, but we can also think about creating a minimum level of healthcare system, whereby you guarantee each member state would need to guarantee a certain number of emergency equipments and certain basic stockpiles, which, as you might know, were declared as existent to the ECDC only at the end of January by most of the countries, but by then only Finland actually complied with those provisions. So there is a case for the European Union to finally deliver on citizens' expectations. What I found fascinating is that virtually everybody, even Eurosceptic and anti-Euro, start looking at the Union as a source for possible solutions during the pandemic. This doesn't have to translate into more Europe, into more integration, but it clearly shows, as it was recently captured by a wonderful survey run by the European Council on Foreign Relations in Berlin, that at the end of the day, there is a desire that Europe plays not necessarily a major geopolitical role in the world, but it would pragmatically solve issues which are pan-European in nature. And I think this is what COVID showed. It showed the incomplete nature of the European integration process. It made it much more observable to the average citizens where the potential of the Union lies, not in harmonizing every single thing, but in exercising a sophisticated role of coordination that allow each country to basically get it right in a situation like this one. It's much easier said than done, but it is possible. And there are many areas of European integration where we have managed to find the right balance between the different levels of governments. There's no reason why we should not be able to continue such a trajectory. There is certainly a case for a great reset of European law. As somebody who belonged to a generation who has been basically studying and has been helping and contributing during my years at the Court of Justice to make sure that the internal market rules actually are a reality, it has been very difficult to accept psychologically that everything basically was suspended, not only state aid rules, but also, Schengen code, and virtually, the Commission stopped doing its job. And there might be good reasons why some of those rules need to be reconsidered. There might be good reason why we have to rethink the competition rules in a circumstances, not only in extraordinary circumstances, but in the new Europe. This is the moment for this great reset, and I think we don't need to be ideological about it, even though I'm slightly nostalgic of that Europe, but it's no longer there. So we need to adapt, we need to adjust. And this applies to the race issue and to the overall legacy we have in devising non-discriminatory mechanisms that were basically reflecting a pretty narrow society in which some issues, including race, were not necessarily very relevant or very much in line with the zeitgeist. Now we are still living in a Europe in which 70 years after basically coming together, if something big like the Dieselgate happened, we have consumers in Germany getting a settlement, but you don't get the Belgian getting the same settlement or the Italians. This is obviously unacceptable vis-a-vis European citizens, but this is a reality, is another part of the incompleteness of Europe. And this applies to many other areas. One of the most tangible outcomes of European integration after 70 years is that we have 20 Europeans who live in a different European country and who cannot exercise their political rights because they cannot vote. Taxation without representation. I was glad to see that The Economist decided to devote the Charlemagne column this week to this issue and to the European Citizen Initiative we have just registered, voting without borders. This idea that we need to link voting rights to the residents and not necessarily to the nationality. All those issues are in the spirit of time, but we are not politically ready to move in order to fill the gaps. But certainly the social norms are changing. The pressure and the dynamic created by COVID will certainly accelerate, like in a fuite en avant, all these processes, and the legal and political system need to be able to absorb in the most rigorous manner what are the most priority issues. And I think each of us has a role to play in this new great reset of the European integration process.
Thank you, Alberto, for sharing with us these final thoughts, which bring to a close our panel, but of course bring to a close our RECONNECT web conference. So I would really like to thank, on behalf of the RECONNECT project, and in particular of the team at the University of Leuven, which has been organizing this event today. I would like to express our gratitude to all our panelists, to Vice President Suitzer, and our audience, of course, for making this web conference a success and an opportunity to continue the all-important debate on reconnecting citizens to the EU through democracy and the rule of law, despite current circumstances. Please keep following our updates on our website at reconnect-europe.eu and our Twitter accounts at reconnect.eu. From all of us, it's thank you and goodbye.